Hebrews chapter 11. Just want to kind of pick up where I left off there. I think I'll start at verse 13. Hebrews 11:13. These all died in faith, and having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. We're going to look at Abraham. I'd like to read this one section. Verse 32, and what shall I say if for the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David also and Samuel and the prophets who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and of imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute and afflicted, tormented. Why are we reading all this? Because of whom the world was not worthy. We couldn't be reading a more honorable list of people. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. But God, having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. To think that their reward, their full recompense is being held back as depends on how we run the race. And until we're done, we're linked with such an honorable group. And their reward and recompense is being held. Wait, we have others running the race. And we're linked with such saints. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. We read, as we had closed last time, about the thoughts and the words of the people that had seen something better than this earth that could be found in this earth. They said, it says in verse 14, they say that such things declare plainly that they seek a country. We're not looking for anything else in this world. We have our mind set, we have seen something better, and they've gone for it. And the reply comes back from heaven that this is my people. God has been pleased with their lives through the efforts and through their moments of faith. God was present with them in all of these things, whether it's a very personal experience of Sarah, or whether it's the painstaking, lengthy thing of Noah, Abraham's lonely wanderings, as it were. God's there. He's pleased. He's present. He's professing The courts of heaven know the esteem that heaven holds for the saints on earth, though the skies may be silent for a time. But they're not going to be so silent forever, because he hath prepared for them a city. God is actually preparing recompense for these dear saints. And then we move into Abraham again. He's mentioned again. It's interesting. After this kind of, what did we just have? Intermission. Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting, doing the reckoning, that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Again, much could be said about this. In my mind, just to bring it down, Abraham realized that Isaac is the one that the promises and the future is going to come through. But now God is telling me to put Isaac on an altar. To him, it didn't equal out. He was doing the reckoning. He was doing the accounting. And it says, how is this going to happen? God is going to have to make it work out. He understood it's going to take the power of God. I'm going to do what God says. People do extreme things, but it's not because they've been called or been asked. But Abraham was given this son, and now he's told to give the son. And he says, God's going to have to work this out. And that's exactly what God does. And Abraham is attributed to offering him. Abraham attributes himself of putting him back to the dead and raising him up again. And the thing that I just want to appreciate is that it was the power of God recognized in Abraham through this difficulty. He looks at it, this is an impossible situation, and it's going to have to take God. This is not something that human addition or human accounting or human effort is going to be able to work through. If this is what's going to happen, God is going to have to do it. And God showed Abraham that day and delivered Isaac and provided a sacrifice. And yet through that experience, we have this unique figure, this unique picture of the type of the Father and Son. Unique in Scripture as far as I understand. And if Abraham hadn't been called to go through this, we wouldn't have such resource for worship, especially on a Sunday morning when we think of Calvary and when we think of what the Lord passed through and when we think of some indication of what it was for the Father and what it was for God. We have this story. God called him through this. And it's another situation where, how is it possible that God could deal with the world of sin in one place, with one man, at one time, on a cross? And the Lord could say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And we understand, but he was never apart from the Father. Calvary is a great mystery and a great wonder. And it took Abraham going through this experience to give us that picture. But there's other things that can come out of it. But there may be experiences and circumstances you say, this is impossible. It's impossible for us. God has the power to reconcile whatever the accounts may look like. We go into Isaac. What do I see here? When I think of this story, when we read it, you read it in Genesis, the weakness and blindness of Isaac, the scheming of his wife, the favoritism that exists in the home, the deception of one son, the eventual hostility and anger and threats of violence of the other son. All of this in one family, the four people. You wonder, is there any potential for faith in this? How could there be anything of faith in this? How could there be anything of God in this? Well, if it's there, God's going to find it. And there is potential in this situation because the Bible tells us by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. We think of those two men, those two boys, in their condition. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. I was trying to consider this. Well, I shouldn't say trying to consider. I was considering it. This is where it starts to get. We've left Abraham, who had a direct command from God. He's moving in faith, not in blind faith. None of these individuals, as I said, moved in blind faith because they were following a word from God. But now we start to get into Isaac. And we realize people are now moving in things that they have been told or things that they have been passed on. And you say, well, when did Isaac know anything about the blessing? And this blessing is interesting to me. When you read the account, there was no doubt in Isaac's mind that there was something to what he was going to say and do and pass on. We think of it, is it just words? It's not just words. To Jacob, it was worth deceiving his own father. To Rebekah, it was worth deceiving her husband. To Esau, it was worth fighting and killing his brother for if he had the chance. None of them doubted the power, the significance of the words that were passed. I wouldn't say I have my arms around it. I understand all that was in that blessing, and I read it and reread it. What's the significance of what Isaac was saying there? But there was no doubt in any of their minds. When Abraham offered, as it were, Isaac, it says the heavens opened. And it was at that point the Lord called from heaven. And it was at that moment when Isaac was there, they had just offered up the ram, and heavens had opened. And Isaac would have heard the voice. I don't know that it was just for Abraham to hear, because it happened there. And the voice that brought the world into beginning, as we have heard from the beginning of this chapter, rings down and blesses Abraham. Abraham, Abraham, lay not thy hand upon the lad. And a great blessing is poured out, and Isaac would have heard it if we understand the story correctly. Abraham certainly heard it. Words of great power from a God of great power. I don't know all that was in this, but we know despite all that was happening in that family, all the dysfunction in that family, God is going to find faith. And God is going to find the potential. And we know it was true because it rolls right into the next account. In verse 21, by faith Jacob. You mean Jacob, that scheming, deceiving swindler of a brother who ran from home and all that he did. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. There was potential in a home of such dysfunction when a blessing of spiritual quality was passed on from a blind father to deceiving and scheming and hurtful boys. There was blessing that could come out of that. Great potential. Because here it is in Jacob. And we see, where did Jacob end us? What kind of progress did Jacob make? Now we see him at this point in his life, despite earlier actions and all of his scheming, despite his great age, despite his own weakness, what a pinnacle that this man has reached. Is this the same Jacob? I like when you read that story. It switches from Israel to Jacob as the narrative goes down. Sometimes he's called Israel. Sometimes he's called Jacob. What a pinnacle. What progress Jacob made. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph. You know the story. He switched his hands. His vision was clear. Not just maybe he may not have been seeing great at that age, but his spiritual vision and his outlook was clear. Clear enough to understand the future for those two boys, God-given prophecy we understand, and clear enough to worship, clear enough to appreciate where God had brought him, but that it wasn't the end. He was truly going to win the race. I appreciate this. Jacob. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, up in age, up in years? Is there opportunity to move in faith and to please God and to carry on? Here's a great example of an old man, even from his own room, even from his own bed. And he's worshiping God. Often we're told the highest occupation, the highest privilege a human being can do is worship God. And here's this man. He goes from being Jacob, the deceiver, to Jacob, the worshiper, leaning upon the top of his staff. Still a pilgrim, still in pilgrim character. He was preserved. Rather be a pilgrim for God. Rather go on for what is better than put any roots down here. He wasn't going to stay in Egypt. He was going to be buried back in Machpelah. The great progress that Jacob had made, and still for all of us to appreciate at any age, opportunity to move in faith based on promises that we know and seeing a future in those that we can pass it on to. And that's exactly what we see in Joseph. Joseph, verse 22, by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. If you go back and read the narrative, you see there's a little lineup where you can think about Joseph and his brothers, Joseph and his boys, and Joseph and his bones. Here he's given commandment concerning his bones. What's happening here? I like the idea of passing on. Passing on. Not just that Joseph was going to be passing on, but he was actually what he wants to pass on before he goes. And we can ask that to ourselves. Hopefully I got a lot of time left. But what do we want to pass on? What do we want to leave? There's that old joke where, thinking about another Barnhardt, and the father opens up the garage door, and it's full of all the stuff that the father's collected all these years. He says, son, it's going to be all yours someday. I don't think any of us want what our fathers have stored up in the garage. Those of you who know my father from West Virginia, you can only imagine what he has stored in his basement, and I certainly don't want that. But what are we going to pass on? Joseph had this act of faith. I'm going to pass on the promises. This is what he's known. This is not a direct command from God now that Joseph is going to be passing on. He's been separated from the land. He was moved down. I want to rush through Joseph's life. We don't have time to go into all of that there, obviously. But at the end of Genesis, we see him, I think it's 60 years of his life is summarized with him being the grandfather and great-grandfather, holding his grandchildren onto his knees. What's he telling them? He's telling them God's going to deliver you. God's going to deliver you. He's pouring into his boys the promises of God. 60 years of this great man's life. It's not summarized with all the accomplishments of Egypt. It's that he was a grandfather. And he's passing on. And when times for the great Exodus comes, I shouldn't say often, it was impressive to me if boys had been raised in the command, in the home of the premier of Egypt. How is it possible that they would have been moved in such echelons, in such areas of Egypt? They were the son of Joseph. And yet when time for came to the Exodus, his boys weren't Egyptians. He had done a wonderful job. Egypt, or his family, wasn't in any of his family. They were Israelites. And when that moment of time, we have to get out, they went out. There were others that joined in the mixed multitude, but Joseph's boys were not Egyptians. He had preserved them from the world around him, though it must have been so much at their fingertips. And Joseph understood, too, that there's no future here for us, and the blessings are with God and his people in the land. And so Joseph gives commandment. He's passing on. And it makes me wonder, what am I passing on? What am I leaving? What impressions are being left? I hope there's something for God and for his people and of something of value for the future to come and for the generations to come. Joseph passing on. Moses, thankfully we've already heard a lot. I don't have to spend a lot of time on that. Just want to maybe say that what has already been said, the perception of Moses' parents by faith when he was born was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw that he was a proper child and that they were not afraid of the king's commandments. They saw what was good and particularly special in this child. And it's no doubt, just kind of skipping on that, why Moses also, when it came to making decisions, he could see. Moses, you read down this, you realize, like his parents, who chose what was right, to do what was right, and to do what was good. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of his reward. You know, this language and the feeling is very similar to Daniel, who purposed in his heart, I'm not going to be defiled with the king's meat. Here's another man who makes choices. He knows what's right. He knows what's wrong. And he goes down. I'm going to choose to suffer. I've weighed it up. And the reproach of Christ, yes, the reproach of Christ, something that he had understood about the Messiah. It's worth suffering with the people of God for the reproach of Christ, the value of divine reward. He saw him who is invisible and was able to forsake all of the glories of Egypt, all of the prestige that he had. And by faith he kept the Passover and obeyed and implemented all the instructions. Purpose. He purposed to choose what was good and what was right based on the things that he knew were good and right and true treasures. Egyptians couldn't see it. Moses could see it. And he made his choices based on the realities up there and the realities coming instead of the passing pleasures that were at his fingertips and at his footsteps. Moses would not become an Egyptian either. He was linked with a greater country. He was linked with a better country. Even though he, with the people of God, would wander all of those years. It's wonderful to see in the New Testament, the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah, Moses in the land, just a foretaste. But to him, he had seen the land before. He had appreciated it. There he was, though, just a foretaste of the reward that is coming for him. The children of Israel, we move on quickly. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians are saying to do were drowned. And by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. Now, these hadn't been, we heard, Moses had already spent the 40 years in the desert. He had come to know the name of God, come to know something of God, the nature of God. If we can say it, these were however many hundreds of thousands of people, and they knew very little about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. New, if I want to say believers as this were, they've come out, they're coming out. Just past redemption of the Passover. Is there faith in so young? As it were, just infants in the things of God? By faith, they passed through the Red Sea. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. So we have old Jacob. And we have, while their ages are varied, figuratively speaking, very young in the things of God. And God says, there's faith there. There's faith there. There's faith there. We can do this. Regardless of our age, regardless of how far we are along. Sometimes I feel, well, I shouldn't say sometimes, he's talking about, have you had this memorized? And he's talking to the young people, and I'm thinking, man, I need to be working on my memorization. I need to be working on this outline in that book. I need to be working on all the studying I need to do. Wherever we are, wonderful. Wherever you are, there's opportunity. You can do this. You can live by faith. You can please God. You can do things that are based on the realities of heaven that exist today. The man who loved you and gave himself for you sits on a throne of great power, and he's coming back for you. And based on that information alone, you could leave this conference this afternoon, this evening, and you could do things that the simple things, basic things, but for that, and they're acts of faith, and they're pleasing to God. We can do this. Israel did it with a lot less knowledge of God than you have. You can do this. We can do this. But I want to get to Rahab. Rahab. At this point now, we're dealing with a woman from a city that was cursed. Actually, I want to read this. What would she have heard of the promises of God? What connection would she have with any degree of the God of Israel? Any blessings? Listen to her words. They were talking about all that Mary could appreciate, being such a young woman. In Joshua 2, her words are, "We have heard," in 10, "we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt." You know, that happened like 40 years ago for her. Because now they're coming into the promised land. So she's talking about things that happened 40 years ago. How much did they impress her? "And what you did to the two kings of the Amorites and the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, and when you utterly destroyed." She was completely up on the history. "And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath." Where did we hear that before? The beginning of the chapter says, "Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of the things which do appear." She says, your God is the Lord, the God of heaven above and of earth beneath. No wonder she says, "Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, and show me a kindness." And what does she say? She asks for a true token. She knew something, some word from that God I could trust. She was already appreciating. She had already come to this point of faith where there's a God of heaven and earth, and He's coming here. She was convinced of the God of truth that she had heard about. Though it was 40 years old, those events probably happened before she was born. And the report, the truth, she's moving in faith based on words and events that happened decades before. She has no connection, no right, no place of grace. She's in a cursed city. The walls are going to fall down. Why should she have any hope? Well, because she's looking in faith to the God of heaven and earth. She's convinced about Him. She's convicted in her own heart. She's not saying, "We don't deserve this," or "Why is He doing this to us?" She understands why He's coming. She understands what happened to the other kings. She knows what's going to happen to Jericho. She's not asking for excuses or looking for excuses or looking for mercy. She's pouring out to Him. She's looking for a token. I want to be saved. I want to be saved. And I don't just want to be saved. What I love about it, she doesn't even say herself first. She says, "Give me a true token, and that ye will save alive my father and my mother and my brethren and my sisters and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death." Where did she come up with this request? The God of heaven and earth. He can save all my family. He can save everybody that can come into my home. And I want you to give me a true token. I want you to leave me a token. Great faith. No wonder she's in this list. By faith, the harlot Rahab perished not. Was God true to His word? She perished not with them. And you read the account, and when Joshua sends up the two men after the walls have come out, "Go bring them out," he brings out the father, the mother, and they're all listed, all preserved, all saved because of the faith and the care and the interest of this one woman. Her interest is in her family, that they would come into the safety and the salvation that she was sure of because of her faith in the God of heaven and earth, the Lord, that she had come to know and she had come to trust. It's no wonder those two men came to her. They went there for practical reasons, and I don't want to stop. I want to move on, but this story is remarkable to me. I'm glad the gospel's following here because it just inspires me. There's salvation for all, regardless of where you are, where you think you are, whether your distance is from God, or how close you think you may be to God. This woman had a care and interest for her family, that they would come into the blessings of preservation from the judgment that was coming. What can I say more? Time would fail me. All of these, I'm not going to reread them. Those that prevailed, those that were persecuted, those that were in poverty. We might ask, what are those people all fired up for? Why don't they just calm down a little bit? Why are they always running all around? By faith they prevailed. By faith they did all of those great things. How about others that were persecuted and killed? We might say it's so sad. They're gone too soon. But heaven's saying the world was never worthy of them. They lived by faith. They haven't lost anything. They have gained. What kind of a life do you want? And those in poverty, they wandered in deserts and in mountains. We might be asking ourselves, why are they there? Why are they down in the deserts? They're moving by faith. And we can be thankful that they're responding to the calls at such cost. Feeling the burden, feeling the pain, they're going. There's great reward coming for them. We can be thankful they're going. All these have gained a good report through faith. Through faith. We can do this. It's not their great actions. Why have they gained a report? Because of their faith. And we have opportunity every day to move in faith, to please God. Wherefore, just in the few minutes I have left, seeing we have all these, we are in a race. We are running. And we're following. We have our eyes on, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, I was thinking of races. The races, few of the ones that we've been to. The author, the one who leads on and goes the whole way, there's usually hardly any clap for him. I've been to a couple where I didn't run, and you're just watching this guy, he's way ahead of the pack, and he crosses the finish line because the rest of the participants on these little local 5Ks, they're all still running. And there's just a few people there, the officiants, and you just hear, and he just had the best time. The ceremony is coming later, but at the time, there was no accolades for the finisher. There was no big cheer. And it reminded me of this. I thought of that when I read these words. Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross and despising the shame and is set down at the right hand of God. And I think about all those that were despised and tortured and lived in poverty, and they finished. They won their race, but to no clapping, to no acclaim, to no reward. The Lord Jesus Christ gave his life, died in pain and shame on a tree, mockery around him. But that was just the end of that race. The crowning day for him is coming. The crowning day for others are coming. All those that have won the race. Faith wins the race. Paul writes, henceforth, 2 Timothy 4:8, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but to all them that love his appearing. When I think about things hoped for, when I think about true treasures that are anticipated, a crown, in this verse, a crown. seeing with the Lord, receiving something from the Lord, a day of righteousness. What about a day of righteousness? To think about a day of righteousness instead of the days that we're living in. Days of righteousness and reward. All those that will be there. His reign and his coronation. I was speaking on Psalm 45 some time ago, and somebody far from here. And I was just thinking about his crowning. And a lady came up after the meeting and said, "You just impressed me because that means I'm going to see a coronation. I've always thought about these coronations. I'm going to see a coronation." I was like, yeah, I didn't mean to do that, but yes, you're going to see a coronation. We're all going to see a coronation. And better than that, we're not going to just see a coronation for the Lord who deserves it, the author and finisher of our faith, but what does Paul say? That Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but to everyone that loves his appearing. It's too good. It's too great. It's not just better. It's the greatest. Are we going to look at all these things around us and lose our time and lose our spot? We're not going to do that. We're not those that fall away. We're going to win the race. We're going to join this great ranks. Is there any place or circumstance where faith cannot be exercised? When we all go back to our homes, there's not one home that faith can't be exercised. There's not one bedroom. Jacob was in his bedroom and he was worshiping in a great act of faith. There's not one place, one room where we're all going to be going where we can't exercise faith. Please God. God has found and followed it all over the earth as he watches and cares for his people. It's true that without faith it's impossible to please God. That's true. But by a life of faith, God has given us opportunity to please him anywhere and everywhere. And we know it's very precious to him.